Beijing, China, 1900. These are terrifying times to be a foreigner in Beijing. A pall of grey smoke hangs in the sky above the ancient city as foreign churches and the stores and homes of Chinese Christians are burned. Angry, murderous mobs rule the streets, led by thousands of Boxer rebels. You are an interpreter for Baron Clemens von Kettler, the German ambassador, and this is the hellscape you're about to venture into. You try one last attempt to dissuade him. Ambassador, it is too dangerous. The Boxers are out for blood. They hacked to death that Japanese diplomat. Puffing on a Cuban cigar, he laughs deeply. Nonsense. They wouldn't dare touch a German. We are going to the Forbidden City, and that's final. You are both carried out in sedan chairs by Chinese coolies. Kettler even refuses to take any German Marines with him. He seems remarkably confident, calmly puffing on his cigar and reading a book, without a care in the world. Only a few miles from the embassy, a crowd begins to form around you. Hatred radiates from their eyes. They start shouting as one, "Shah! Shah! Kill! Kill!" Soon they are joined by imperial soldiers and Boxer rebels in their red turbans. The yelling of "Kill the barbarians!" reaches a crescendo. "Sir, we must turn back." "Nonsense," roars Kettler. "Let us through, you filthy heathens, or you'll feel the crack of my whip." The coolies carrying you flee in terror, sending both yourself and the ambassador crashing to the floor. An indignant Kettler roars at the crowd to part, when a Chinese soldier steps forward and calmly shoots him in the head. The crowd surges forward and tears at his body, while punching and kicking you. Badly injured, you somehow fight your way out and run back to the embassy. The Boxers have come to Beijing, and with them comes death. I am your host, James Barton. Welcome to Forgotten Wars.
This country is at war with Germany.
Today, our armed forces joined our NATO allies in airstrikes against Serbian forces.
Eagle 1, first strike, you have permission to engage the target.
In the first few hours after our servicemen went to the rescue of young Americans and of democracy in Grenada,
Damals uns ausgebildet. Wollen diese 4 Jahre nützen.
Hello everyone, welcome to the show. In this episode, we're covering one of my favourite conflicts, and certainly one of the strangest in history. Social upheaval, technical change, and international meddling were tearing apart the millennia-old Chinese Empire in 1900. Out of the chaos and decay arose the Boxer Rebellion. Soon, the foreign embassies in Beijing were under siege as the revolt spread across northern China. To rescue them and stamp Western authority on China once and for all, one of the most surreal forces ever created would have to fight its way through hostile territory. Never before, and really never again, would the flags of Japan, Germany, Russia, America, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Austria-Hungary fly over one joint army. Before 1842, unless you lived in the port of Canton, the average Chinese citizen would probably have never seen a European or an American. Trade was closely controlled and very much on China's terms. After the Opium Wars, Britain, France, the US, and other major powers bludgeoned China into setting aside treaty ports, where foreigners could enjoy extraterritorial privileges, basically exempting them from all Chinese laws. Diplomats, soldiers, and traders flocked to this ever-growing list of ports. British and American traders imported tons of opium, creating millions of Chinese addicts, under the protective guns of the British and US navies. Western imports destroyed the market for Chinese goods. Miners lost their livelihoods when their mines were given to European interests, while Western-built railroads, called iron centipedes by the Chinese, put bargemen and porters on the Grand Canal out of work. Even worse, in Shandong province, the future stronghold of the Boxers, Chinese burial sites were demolished to make way for German railroads and telegraph lines. In response to Chinese protests, German troops opened fire and shot protesters. Westerners were not winning the hearts and minds in northern China, that's for sure. Following closely behind came the Christian missionaries. By 1894, there were 2,000 foreign missionaries in China who claimed almost 800,000 native converts, all of who now had extraterritorial rights as well. Inevitably, for every genuine convert, there were other opportunists who just wanted to prey on their fellow Chinese while being exempt from the law. It got so bad that whole bandit gangs would suddenly convert to Christianity to avoid punishment. The new foreign religion was getting a bad name. The elite Mandarin bureaucrats who ran the empire wondered if it would even survive. Britain had taken Hong Kong and carved out vast spheres of influence. France had conquered its former vassals in Indochina and was now expanding into the empire from the south, while Germany and other powers were seizing ports and concessions by the day. Most humiliatingly, even Japan, a people dismissed as, quote, Eastern monkeys, end quote, by the imperial court, had modernized and defeated China in 1895, conquering Taiwan and Korea. In the dog-eat-dog world of late-stage imperialism, China appeared to be the next dish on the menu. Caught between the old ways and the modern world that was increasingly forcing itself upon the Chinese people, whether they wanted it to or not, all eyes turned to the imperial court in Beijing, but they didn't seem to have any answers. Just a side note, it was known as Peking at this time, but to avoid confusion, I'll be using its modern name in this podcast. By 1900, the decadent, despotic Qing dynasty, which had ruled China since 1644, was on its last legs. The government was so inept and corrupt that by comparison, one historian suggests Tsarist Russia was, quote, a model of dynamism and progressive thought, end quote. If you know your Russian history, that's quite a burn. The emperors of China were mere frontmen by now of the real power behind the throne. The Empress Dowager Zhu Xi. Starting life as a half-literate, 8th-rank concubine, this remarkable, if fearsome woman plotted her way to power. Nicknamed the Old Buddha, allegedly she was a nymphomaniac who slept with thousands of young studs while holding vast orgies in the imperial palace. Take this with a grain of salt. A lot of the claims are based on a dubious book called Manchu Decadence, allegedly a biography of a European who, after a chance encounter in a gay brothel, worked his way up to become her foreign gigolo. It's quite a funny book, just remember it's mostly fairy tales and extremely graphic. It is true that she drank only fresh breast milk and smoked opium pipes every morning, despite condemning it in public. When she eventually banned opium again, she carefully excluded the over-60s such as herself. While she held the faltering regime together, she hated the West and modernization in general. When the emperor, Huang Shu, hoping to follow in the footsteps of Tsar Peter the Great and the Emperor Meiji, launched a series of bold modernizing reforms, he lasted just 102 days before being deposed and imprisoned by the old Buddha. His advisors weren't so lucky, they were all killed. When she did try reforms, they were never followed through. Building a vast modern navy, she then diverted funds for its upkeep to rebuild the summer palace, including a beautiful lakeside pavilion in the shape of an elegant marble pleasure boat. Starved of funds and forbidden to drain, that navy was destroyed by the Japanese. With the imperial court sunk in decadence and indecision, nature itself seemed to turn against the Middle Kingdom. Catastrophic floods swept Shandong province in 1898, followed by a drought that winter. Millions of peasants were left landless and hungry. Soon, all of this was being blamed on the foreigners and the Christians. Tales spread of missionaries making medicines out of children's eyes and hearts, or drinking women's menstrual blood. Out of this maelstrom of hopelessness, despair, anger, and fear came the Boxers. They started off in Shandong province, notorious for its social unrest, apocalyptic cults, and armed gangs. There is no more destabilizing force in a society than angry, unemployed young men, especially if they're unable to marry due to relative poverty. Shandong was filled with such desperate young men. Spontaneously, they began to form groups that performed elaborate martial arts displays and demonstrations of strength. If you have seen the movie Fight Club, it was similar to that, but for young peasant men, often only teenagers. They were trying to reclaim control and pride in a rapidly changing, chaotic world. But just like the Fight Club in the movie, they soon began to rapidly mutate into something far more dangerous. Soon across the plains of northern China, men wearing red turbans or black scarves around their waists began travelling from village to village. They preached about a way to end the cycles of disaster and despair through a new magical fighting style. Young men were trained in martial arts and using weapons, as well as how to summon and be possessed by warrior spirits. Once they were fully indoctrinated, they were shown the greatest magical power of all. Focusing hard, you perform the complex movements you've been practicing for ages. Your young life has been one of suffering and hopelessness. Losing your job due to the foreigners, your family home destroyed by the floods, extreme poverty, the anger and frustration gnawed at your very soul. But then, your new brothers arrived, teaching you how to be strong, giving you purpose, to drive out the foreigners, the Christians and the traitors. Only you, and those like you, can save China. Today, you will finally prove that you have perfected the greatest magic the brothers can teach, becoming invincible to bullets. Along with the other initiates, you line up as the master pulls out a gun. You close your eyes, and your breath catches in your throat, as at point-blank range, he raises the gun, excited and terrified, pleading with the gods that you haven't screwed up the rituals. You await the moment of truth. The boom of the gun shatters the silence, and for a moment you stand perfectly still, waiting for the burning sensation of a bullet. But none comes. Opening your eyes, you realize you survived. It worked. Everyone cheers and the master claps you on the shoulder before moving on to the next man. You are now the invincible vengeance of your people on those who have ground them underfoot for so long. You are one of the brothers. This was a real practice of the Boxers. They taught that by performing elaborate rituals, a man could be possessed by warrior spirits and rendered immune to bullets. Of course, the guns they were firing at these demonstrations were actually filled with blanks. When Boxers were killed, their leaders inevitably found excuses. They hadn't been pious enough or sufficiently committed. Armed vigilante groups with names such as the Big Sword Society and the Plum Blossom Fists rampaged across northern China. Qing officials were beaten up, churches burned to the ground, and Chinese Christians massacred. Soon they combined under one name, the Righteous and Harmonious Fists. English-speaking missionaries, unfamiliar with Chinese martial arts, described them with the closest word they had: boxers. The imperial court was originally terrified of this new and violent force. They were condemned and local mandarins were told to crush them. However, the conservative anti-foreigner faction of China's elite bureaucrats saw in the boxers something useful. They were diamonds in the rough, of course, but with some direction and polishing, they could be the key to driving out the Westerners and their Christian faith. Skillful manipulation and official patronage soon led to the anti-Qing part of the Boxer beliefs being sidelined. Instead, it was now all about fighting the foreigners. By May 1900, the Boxers were advancing on Beijing, slaughtering Chinese Christians, ripping up railway and telegraph lines, burning churches and railway stations along the way. Beijing at this time was a city of walls, each seemingly thicker than the last. Behind one set was the Tartar city, the home of the nobility. Then there was the imperial city where the emperor ruled from. Squeezed in between was a legation quarter, filled with the foreign embassies of 11 nations. Life in the legations had been a pleasant bubble for the Westerners, isolated from the chaos of the countryside. Now, though, it could no longer be ignored. As one missionary wrote, quote, "The country is full of the wildest rumours and threats. The people have nothing to do but talk, and they talk of killing the foreigners and Christians. We feel that the end may not be far off." End quote. A multinational force of 350 soldiers raced to Beijing, briefly raising morale. U.S. Minister Edwin H. Conger exclaimed that, quote, "Thank God you've come. Now we're safe." End quote. Few people have been so wrong in their predictions. It was all far too little, far too late. The Boxers cut the railway line between Beijing and the port of Tientsin, isolating the legations, and they burned both the grandstand at the foreigners' racetrack and the British summer legation. On June the 11th, Japanese diplomat Tsujiyama Akira ventured outside and was hacked to pieces by imperial soldiers, now openly on the side of the Boxers. Akira's death was only the beginning. When hot-headed German minister Clemens von Kettler, who we met at the start, shot a boy he believed was a Boxer, anger surged through the neighbourhood surrounding the legation quarter. On June the 16th, mobs attacked and burned churches, foreign businesses, and the homes of Chinese Christians. Blood-curdling chants of "Shah! Shah! Kill! Kill!" echoed around the city. Young bucks from the legations, as if going on a big game hunt, would venture outside to bag a Boxer and rescue Christians. Westerners killed hundreds of Chinese in these forays, sometimes without provocation, further inflaming the temperature of Beijing. As things went from bad to worse in the capital, the epic fast that was the Seymour expedition set out to rescue them. Admiral Edward Seymour, who was a young man who fought in the Second Opium War, had cobbled together 2,000 Marines from all the great powers. As it would throughout this war, managing all the jealousies and national rivalries would be a tough task. The Westerners in general still weren't taking the Boxers seriously. Seymour and his officers were so overconfident that they gambled on going by train through Boxer-held territory. Packing their full dress uniforms, Seymour boasted they expected to be in Beijing no later than the next evening. Actually, he would never reach the capital. Travelling in 4 troop trains, progress was glacially slow, as they had to constantly repair tracks torn up by the rebels. Even more worrying, the Imperial troops, who Seymour had assumed would help them, were clearly on the side of the Boxers. Reaching Langfang, roughly halfway to Beijing, the foreign troops were swarmed by Boxers wearing red sashes and waving swords, pitchforks and clubs. Although Chinese troops generally had up-to-date Western guns, the Boxers did not. But what they lacked in firepower, they made up for with suicidal courage. Henry Savage Landor, a British war correspondent, described how the Boxers, quote, in a state of hysterical frenzy, dashed straight into the guns of the Allied troops, exposing themselves with bare chests to the bullets of foreign rifles. End quote. At least 35 Boxers were killed by the steady cracking of the troops' Maxim guns and rifles. At Langfang, they were stuck. Ahead, the tracks were torn up and advance parties were mauled by Boxer ambushes. Seymour refused to abandon the trains, and they became a magnet for more attacks. By now, the Boxers had been joined by the most formidable of the Imperial armies that fought the Allies, the Kansu Muslim Braves under General Dong. Now that's a great name. Fanatically anti-Western and loyal to the Emperor, they were also well-trained and armed with modern rifles. We were meant to be in Beijing by now. Instead we become washerwomen, your mate grumbles as you wash your uniforms. The heat beats down unforgivingly as you laugh and reply, I'll stop wedging, Terry. Though I have to admit, doesn't look like we're getting to Beijing any time soon. As you swat a fat mosquito that lands on your arm, a shout goes up. Boxers! Looking at the large red splodge left behind by the mosquito, you hope it's not an omen. Rank after rank of Boxers, with red banners, turbans and bandanas soon appear, roaring out their strange battle cries. Firecrackers popping around them, they charge screaming towards the trains. It's like shooting fish in a barrel. So many fall screaming to the ground as the barrel of your rifle heats up. But there are so many, with no fear of death. Only the steady chatter of the machine guns is holding them back. Still, some get close enough to attack, and one thrusts his spear at your chest. Dodging just in time, you ram your rifle butt into his stomach, and then smack him over the head. Still he rises, yelling, Shah! Until you shoot him at point-blank range. As the Boxers fall back to reorganize, you see cavalrymen forming up. These aren't rebels. They're Imperial Chinese troops. They thunder towards you, blazing away with their modern rifles. Terry's head snaps back as blood splatters on your face. But there's no time to mourn. Your gun continues to bark as a cavalryman falls from his horse. With his foot caught in the stirrup, he is dragged along the floor by the charging steed. As the Imperials fall back, the Boxers prepare to charge again. The Boxers were used as cannon fodder, pressuring and distracting the Allies with human wave attacks, while Dong's sharpshooters inflicted heavy casualties from afar. It was brutal fighting, especially when Kansu cavalry tried to overwhelm weak spots in the line. They were eventually forced back, with over 500 Chinese soldiers and Boxers lying dead on the battlefield. But the Allies had suffered 58 casualties, were tired and low on ammunition. That same day, Boxers cut the tracks between Langfang and Tientsin, leaving the Seymour column stranded. This happened because the leaders of the French and German contingents had refused Seymour's request to take a train back to the rear to keep open the column's line of communication. They were afraid that if they did so, the British and American contingents would seize all the glory of entering Beijing first. As I warned, those international jealousies are really beginning to shine through. Finding his advance blocked, his rear harassed, and his provisions running out, and his ammunition dangerously low, Seymour was forced to make a fighting retreat. With their trains now useless and pockmarked by bullets, they were abandoned, and the Allies began marching on foot towards Tientsin, 30 miles away, with the supplies and wounded men being transported in 4 junks down the river. As they slowly retreated, life didn't get any better for the poor men of the Seymour expedition. Not only did they have to deal with Chinese cavalry, infantry and artillery attacks, but also with blinding dust storms kicked up by savage winds. Casualties quickly mounted. The Americans bore the brunt of the fighting because they had been given the place of honour in the lead. I'll be honest, I'm not sure how much of an honour that actually was in this case. Seymour's expedition stumbled on to the Imperial Armoury at Hisku, located just a few miles north of Tientsin. The foreigners had no idea of the existence of this 40-acre complex, which gives some sense of just how bad their intelligence and general knowledge of China was. The Allied troops stormed the compound early the next morning, or at least the Royal Marines did, assisted by the Americans and Germans. The French and Russians refused to cooperate with Seymour's plan. Not cool, Russians and French, not cool. Inside, Seymour's men discovered copious stores of modern guns, ammunition, as well as plenty of rice. Though Tientsin was only a few miles away, the men were tired, and the compound was soon surrounded by Chinese troops. So Seymour decided to hold up and wait for relief. The would-be rescuers were now in desperate need of rescuing themselves. That supposedly easy journey had cost the Westerners 300 casualties. They were roughly back where they started from, and they were now surrounded. Things were not going well. Since the telegraph lines had been cut, the foreigners in Tientsin and Beijing had no idea where the Admiral's forces had gone. These 2,000 men seemed to have vanished off the face of the earth. Many assumed they'd been wiped out. The Chinese concluded, not unreasonably, that they had scored a major victory in defeating the Seymour expedition. Soon celebrated throughout northern China, the prestige of the Boxers reached new heights. The triumphant rebels surged into Tientsin, seizing control of the Chinese districts and putting the westerner areas under siege. Among the besieged was future US President Herbert Hoover. About 2,300 troops, marines and sailors, mostly Russians, faced Boxers and Imperial soldiers more than 10 times their number. Hoover, trained as a civil engineer, was in charge of designing the fortifications. Emptying the city's warehouses, he directed the construction of a 2-mile-long barricade made of bales of wool or camel hair and bags filled with peanuts, sugar and rice. Hoover's wife Lou volunteered to nurse the wounded. Armed with a pistol, she bicycled throughout the defences every day on her errands. She had at least one close call when one of her bicycle tyres was punctured by a Chinese bullet. A pistol-packing, bullet-dodging future First Lady, everyone. With things going from bad to worse in Beijing and Tientsin, and the damp squib that was a Seymour expedition seemingly vanishing off the face of the earth, Allied warships steamed to the Taku Bar, the entrance of the Gulf of Chili, to the Peiho River, which leads to Tientsin and then to Beijing. It was protected by 4 forts, 2 on each side of the river, that had been rebuilt by German engineers after being captured by the Franco-British forces in 1860. They had been tough enough then, causing a bloody disaster for the British at first. On June 16th, 1900, a council of Allied officers met aboard a Russian warship and decided that the forts had to be neutralised in order to begin the relief of the embattled Westerners. They demanded that the Chinese surrender the forts within 24 hours, or else. The naval commanders took this momentous step, really a declaration of war, entirely on their own authority. When Sir Claude MacDonald, the British minister, learned of it a few days later, he fretted that they had, quote, sounded the death knell of the foreigners in Beijing, end quote. He wasn't far wrong. Although the Allied ultimatum caused the battle, it was the Chinese who fired the first shot. At 12:50 a.m. on June the 17th, just as the deadline was about to expire, the Taku forts opened fire with their German Krupp artillery, the best in the world. A Russian vessel made the stupid mistake of turning on its searchlight. Now about as conspicuous as a Christmas tree, it was soon being pounded by Chinese shells and taking horrific casualties. While terrible for the Russians, it did distract the gunners from the rest of the fleet. Allied gunboats returned fire, but their light cannons made little dent on the thick fortress walls, and to a couple of lucky shots blew up 2 of the fort's powder magazines. At dawn, a landing force composed of British, Italian, German, Russian, Austrian and Japanese sailors and marines landed in the mudflats and marched 1,300 yards to the northwest fort. The first man over the ramparts, a courageous Japanese officer, was killed, but the rest of the Allied troops would not be stopped, and just 15 minutes later, the first fort fell. By 6:30 a.m., after almost 6 hours of combat, all the Taku forts had been taken, at a cost of only 7 Allied dead and 15 wounded. Another 24 sailors were killed in the nighttime artillery exchange. By all rights, this scrappy, poorly planned and badly coordinated attack against entrenched positions should never have succeeded. That it did is because of an old problem we came across in my series on the Opium Wars, the poor quality of leadership among the Chinese soldiers. Thanks to this failure to hold the strong positions at Taku, the way was now open for the Allies to advance deep into the interior of the Celestial Kingdom. The only great power not to join the assault on the Taku forts had been the US, still on the fence about just how involved in this war it wanted to be. However, a stray Chinese shell had hit the USS Monocacy, an ancient paddle-wheel steamer. While not doing much damage, this would become the casus belli for the full might of America to descend on China. While the Battle of the Taku Forts was raging, the Boxers were swarming all over Beijing, and the Seymour expedition was floundering away, a momentous meeting had convened amid the faded splendour of the Forbidden City. The old Buddha, the Empress Dowager Su Shi herself, taking a break from those alleged orgies and opium smoking, met with 100 of her top mandarins, princes and generals to decide on a course of action regarding the Boxers. There was a sharp division between those led by General Zheng Lu and the Southern viceroys who wanted to suppress the Boxers and save the foreigners, and the xenophobic mandarins led by the bold and brash Prince Tuan who wanted to wipe out the foreign devils. At a key moment, Prince Tuan, with a dramatic flourish, presented the Empress with a high-handed ultimatum, allegedly from the Westerners themselves. It demanded that China surrender total control over all its military and financial affairs to the foreigners. The ultimatum was actually a forgery, but she had no way of knowing that and was outraged. When news then reached her of the attack on the Taku forts, she declared in a fiery speech that, quote, "Now they have started the aggression, and the extinction of our nation is imminent. If we just fold our arms and yield to them, I would have no face to see our ancestors after death. If we must perish, why don't we fight to the death? I have always been of the opinion that the Allied armies have been permitted to escape too easily in 1860. Only a united effort was then necessary to have given China the victory. Today, at last, the opportunity for revenge has come." End quote. When she mentions 1860, she's referring to the Second Opium War. What had started as an internal rebellion in China had now transformed into a war pitting North China against the combined might of the West, plus Japan. Southern and Central China remained peaceful. The imperial authorities there simply ignored the Empress's decree. This was because there hadn't been nearly as much exposure to Western culture or missionary activities in the south and centre than there had been in the north. Reminds me of the quote about Afghanistan: the less they see of us, the more they will like us. Identical notes started arriving at each of the legations, notifying them that China was breaking diplomatic relations, and that if they didn't evacuate to Tientsin by 4 p.m. the next day, their safety could no longer be assured. There was much confusion among the foreign community in Beijing over what to do. Most of the ministers leaned towards following the demand, even if this meant abandoning countless Chinese Christians to a gruesome fate. Then, everything went to hell. As we saw in the opening dramatization, the hot-headed Baron Clemens von Kettler decided completely off his own bat to go and harangue the Chinese foreign minister. Taking no troops with him, just an unfortunate interpreter, he met his own gruesome end. As a side note, when the Allies later took Beijing, the Germans identified an army corporal named Ern Hai as the culprit. They beat him to a pulp and decapitated him on the spot where von Kettler had died. Rather ironically, considering the future, they found his pleas that he had only acted under orders, quote, contemptible, end quote. News of Kettler's death swept like wildfire through the legations. Polly Condit Smith, a young American woman visiting the US legation, later wrote that, quote, when the story of von Kettler's murder had been confirmed, a shiver of horror shook each and every foreigner then in Beijing, and we realized, perhaps for the first time, the horror of our position. End quote. Any talk of evacuation was now abandoned. All feared they would share the Baron's fate if they ventured outside. There was also no sign of Admiral Seymour's expedition. One wag in the British legation joked that he should be renamed Admiral See No More. The foreigners had no choice but to dig in and await Chinese attacks. The siege of the Beijing legations had begun. The legation area covered 85 acres, bounded on the south by the Tartar city walls, and on the north by the wall of the Forbidden City, the whole bisected by a smelly open sewer canal called the Jade River. As well as the embassies, it also contained numerous businesses as well. To create a defensible perimeter, the outlying premises belonging to Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy and Austria-Hungary had to be left out. Absorbed into the fortified areas were also parts of adjoining Chinese neighbourhoods. A key section of the defences was a segment of the Tartar wall that ran from a ramp near the American legation, east past the Imperial Canal, to a point near the German legation. If enemy troops or Boxers possessed the high wall, they could rain down deadly fire upon the trapped Westerners. The British legation was selected as a fallback position for a last stand if the outer fortifications were breached. Their compound was surrounded by a 10-foot-high wall, and inside were several wells that provided pure water. Reflecting the general craziness the British often show in stressful situations, two brothers, Nigel and David Oliphant, both of who were civilian volunteers, went to work laying out a golf putting course on the legation grounds. Because when you're surrounded by angry Chinese calling for your blood, it's the perfect time to work on your putting. Into this compound were jammed almost 900 Europeans, plus at least 3,000 terrified Chinese Christians. They would be treated pretty badly. The Chinese Christians were shuffled off to the mansion of 14 acres of grounds belonging to Prince Su, located opposite the British legation, but only after the Europeans had looted the palace of any valuables. It would be the Chinese Christians who would suffer the most during the siege, because the Europeans hoarded the stocks of food. By the end of the siege, the starving Chinese converts were reduced to eating tree bark and leaves, while the Europeans still enjoyed free-flowing champagne. The chief complaint among the Westerners was all the fresh meat was consumed in the first few days. Thereafter, they were forced to dine on tinned foods and fresh horse meat. The prize racing ponies belonging to the diplomats were carved up at the rate of 2 or so a day. Quote, "The all-important question now is not if Cochon will win more cups in the future," joked Polly Condit Smith about a prize horse, "but if his stakes will be tender." End quote. The defence of the compound fell to 408 soldiers and 125 male volunteers. They had few heavy weapons. The Marines had brought a Colt machine gun, the British a Nordenfelt 5-barreled gun, the Italians a 1-pound cannon, and the Austrians a Maxim gun. That's all they had to face countless thousands of attackers. The area under defence gradually diminished as the siege wore on, but never amounted to less than 2,100 yards of perimeter, which left the defenders stretched perilously thin. Originally, command of this ragtag force fell to Captain Eduard von Foreman of the Austrian cruiser the Zenta. He managed to make a spectacular mistake on his very first day on the job. An apparently very excitable man, upon hearing a rumour that the American legation was abandoned, he ordered all the international forces to retreat into the British legation for their final last stand. Amid the confusion, it was some time before it became clear that the captain had panicked, and that the American legation was still completely safe. Fortunately, the enemy did not realise the fatal advantage it had in its grasp. If they had, I'd now be talking about the Great Massacre of Beijing in 1900. Unsurprisingly, no one had any faith now in von Foreman. He was shoved aside and replaced by the British minister Sir Claude MacDonald, who would be in command for the rest of the siege. However, this poor man's job would turn out to be like herding cats. The different nationalities frequently disobeyed his orders and threw temper tantrums. France and Russia, I'm particularly looking at you here. In the first 4 days of the siege, the legations were raked by gunfire, while chants of "kill, kill, kill the foreign barbarians" echoed around the defenders. But the Chinese troops' principal weapon was fire. Setting fire to nearby buildings, they tried to burn out the foreigners. In turn, the Westerners frantically tried to put out the flames, all the while Chinese sniper bullets ricocheting around them. With the failure of the fire attacks, the Imperial armies settled in for an anaconda strategy, slowly trying to squeeze the legations to death. It became like medieval siege warfare with mines and towers. For those trapped inside, life became a mixture of bullets whizzing overhead, stifling temperatures over 100 degrees, and nauseating smells that emanated from the dead dogs, horses, and people. Polly Smith complained, quote, "The temperature is like a Turkish bath without the clean smell." End quote. The men constantly puffed cigars and cigarettes to mask the smell, and some of the more daring ladies followed suit. The women took care of the young and wounded, prepared food, and sewed sandbags at a feverish pace, many from Prince Su's fine linens. It's one of the few times in history that soldiers would shelter behind sandbags made with lace flourishes. Ironically, the Boxers who had started all the trouble in the first place were not involved in the attack on the legations. The unruly Boxers had started looting the nobility's homes in the Tartar city, leading to an annoyed Dowager Empress expelling them from Beijing. Those rowdy Boxers had been ordered to go and help the assault on Tientsin. The siege of the legations was now completely under the control of the Imperial army. As the legations battled for survival, northern China became a hellscape. 200 missionaries and countless Chinese Christians were killed, with the grisliest violence reserved for the so-called second-class devils, the Chinese Christians themselves. A Sheng, a resident of a small town in Chile province, recalled years later that when Boxers came, they burned dozens of Chinese Christian families to death. Quote, "When one young woman escaped from the flames, her belly was cut open with a sword by the Boxers. One could hear the sound of skin separating from bones. Several Boxers grabbed the woman by the thighs and arms and threw her back into the flames. The savagery was unspeakable. End quote. Back at Tientsin, the failed Seymour expedition had at least been rescued. A missionary recorded that, quote, "I shall never forget, to my dying day, the long string of dusty, travel-worn soldiers who for a fortnight had been living on quarter rations and fighting every day. The men were met by kind ladies with pails of tea, which the poor fellows drank as they had never drunk before, some bursting into tears." End quote. There was no time to rest. 50,000 Boxers and Imperial troops, under the command of General Ni Xingnen, had surrounded the foreigner concession at Tientsin, determined to overrun it. It began with a huge human wave attacks of screaming Boxers charging towards the defences. As you line up and prepare to charge the foreign devils, you're not as confident as you once were. The ground is littered with the dead bodies of your brothers, the remnants of wave after wave of attacks on their positions. You can't help but notice how the regular soldiers haven't made a single charge yet, letting you take all the casualties. They seem hostile, yet you're on the same side against the foreigners. It doesn't make sense. As you perform the mystical rituals, your master calls out, "Those who fell were not pious enough. You must love the movement and love China with all your heart, without any fear. This time we will break through. Support the Manchus! Destroy the foreign!" As you chant your battle cry, your fears are temporarily gone, though an annoying voice in your head wonders how so many of your brothers, that you knew personally, could not have been committed enough. Still, you charge the enemy, and immediately the foreign devil's guns open up in a hailstorm of bullets. You bare your chest proudly to the lethal lead. They cannot harm you. Yet all around your brothers are collapsing to the floor dead and injured. The screams of pain echo in your ears. Then a burning pain erupts in your leg. You've been hit, but you followed all the rituals exactly, just like the rest. How can this happen? Your doubts are now free to spread through your mind, and you start hobbling back to the Chinese lines for what's left of your brothers. But then you notice something weird. The machine guns of the regular Imperial troops are preparing to fire at you. They can't do this. You're on the same side. You're fighting for China. You try to scream at them, but no words come out. General Ni was a conflicted figure in this war, as he hated the foreigners, but also hated the Boxers just as much. Regarding them as little better than rioting mobs, he ordered his troops to massacre the fleeing Boxers with machine guns. His excuse was that he was punishing deserters. Life was certainly cheap in northern China, circa 1900. With the Boxer part of his force destroyed, he then launched his regular troops against the foreign concession, but failed to break through. An uneasy stalemate resulted as he tried to starve them out. Things were not looking good for the trapped Westerners, but help was on the way. One of the strangest armies in history was being created to rescue them, as well as inflicting bloody vengeance on the Chinese. The Imperial Court were going to rue the very day they chose to ally with the Boxers. Thank you for listening. To help the podcast grow, please like, leave a review, or tell a friend. In part 2 of this series, The Besieged Foreigners and Legations, desperately try to hold on, while an Allied army faces brutal fighting as it battles its way to Beijing. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, the faction fighting in the imperial court was only going to get more violent, bizarre, and treacherous. See you next time for more Forgotten Wars.